everybody, my name is Putu Kanno. Today, me and my group are going to present about flexible exchange rates. So what is flexible exchange rate? A flexible, or in other words, a floating exchange rate is a regime where the currency price of a nation is set by the forex market based on supply and demand relative to the other currencies. And what makes the flexible exchange rate move one way or another? From the next slide, we are going to answer this question by developing a model of how the nominal exchange rate is determined in currency markets. First is trade-based model. In a trade-based model of exchange rate determination, the nominal exchange rate is determined by purchases and sales of currency arising from the imports and the exports. So in this chapter, we will rewrite the relationship of equation of foreign savings equal the trade deficits into this equation, which is the SF equals Z minus E. SF is the foreign savings, Z is the imports, E is the exports. So we use Mexico as home country and United States as a foreign country, for example, just like in the previous chapter. If we look at this graph of 15.1, the SF is the foreign savings, and this savings is supplied by the US residents who buy the Mexican assets. So therefore, the SF equals the demand for pesos or supply of dollars by the US. So we assume that the demand is invariant, or in other words, it's never changing with the respect to value of pesos. So it will result in the perfectly inelastic demand for pesos curve like it is shown in the graph, like this. The Z min E is the trade deficit, or the Z is import, E is export, so imports minus the exports equals to the trade deficit, which in this case, the trade deficit is the net demand for the US goods by the Mexico. So it is shown that the Z has the positive relationship to the value of pesos, and the E or the exports have a negative relationship to the value of the peso. Because the Z and E have the positive and negative relationship, it will result in Z min E in a positive relationship to the value of the pesos. And as the value of peso will increase, the trade deficit will expand, and it will shows an upward sloping supply of pesos, like in this figure 15.2. So the next is exchange rate terminology. Under the flexible exchange rate regime, an increase in E, or a fall or decrease in the value of peso is called the depreciation. And vice versa, if the decrease on E or a rise in the value of the pesos is called the appreciation. So by combining the demand of pesos and the supply of pesos together, it will give the figure 15.3, like in this picture right here. So we assume that the exchange rate is flexible, and we will consider three alternatives of exchange rates, which is the 1 per E1, 1 per E0, and 1 per E2. So first is 1 per E1. As we can see here, the supplies of pesos along the Zmin E, or this is the trade deficit, will exceed the demand for pesos in the line of SF, as you can see here. And this means that there's an excess supply for pesos. And it means that it is reducing the value of pesos, and it will result in the falling of the trade deficit that brings the supply and demand of pesos into equality. So, and the next is 1 per E2. It is shown that the demand for pesos exceeds the supply of pesos. The demand exceeds the supply of pesos, right? This increases the value of peso that will result in the rising of the trade deficit, and the rise in the trade deficit will bring the supply and demand of pesos into equality. And for the I per E0, the demand for pesos is completely equal with the supply of pesos. As you can see here, the demand and supply is equal. So the value of pesos will remain the same, and it will represent the equilibrium in the peso market. In this trade-based model, only trade flows will respond to the change in value of the peso. So we can use the trade-based model from the figure 15.3, like before, to analyze one aspect of increased global financial integration, namely the possibility of the capital inflows, like in the 15.4 figure. As we can see in the graph, the inflow of capital in the form of foreign savings shifts the SF curve to the right. It will shift the SF curve to the right, and then at the equilibrium value of the pesos, or the 1 per E0, the demand for pesos represented by the SF, this SF exceeds the supply of pesos, which is represented by the Z min E line, this. And this excess demand for pesos will result in the value of the pesos begin to increase towards the 1 per E1 line. You can see it will increase, and because of that, there will be an appreciation of pesos, just like I mentioned before in the table, just like in this table, where when there's a decrease in E or a rise in value of pesos, there will be an appreciation. As this occurs, the trade deficit will expand along the Z minus E graph, and the supply of pesos will therefore increase to meet the demand at the I per E1. So for the next part is going to explain by my friend.
Hello everyone, my name is Daniel and I'm going to be explaining about flexible exchange rate with an asset-based model approach. So this asset approach to exchange rate determination, it views foreign currency transactions as arising from the buying and selling of foreign currency denominated assets rather than just from trade flows. Or in other words, it focuses on foreign savings rather than on the trade deficit. Alright, in order to learn about this further, we're going to assume ourselves to be a Mexican investor, and we're going to decide on the allocation of the wealth portfolio between two assets. The first one, a peso denominated asset, and the second one being dollar. And we will be taking both assets to be open-ended mutual funds with fixed domestic currency prices, and also we're going to be focusing on the rates of return between these two alternative assets. Okay, so the return of the peso denominated asset, it is the interest rate itself, so which is RM, so that's the equation. And then for the dollar denominated asset, we need to consider two things, with the first one being rate of interest or interest rate, and then the exchange rate, which is E. And in order to see this further, let's suppose that first we have the initial exchange rate, which is 1.0, and the dollar denominated asset is valued $1,000, which in peso also is 1,000. And then let's assume that peso depreciates and the $1,000 value became 1,100 peso when the peso depreciates. So that's the rate of the return that we get. So therefore we can see also that the exchange rate also changed to 1.1 from 1.0. Okay, so we just learned that the exchange rate may change in a certain period of time based on the previous assumption. Therefore, expected rate of depreciation of the peso, we have the equation, the e in the power of e minus e divided by e. Right, so the e in the power of e, it means that it is the expected exchange rate in the future. And the e is exchange rate at a certain period of time. Right. And then total expected rate of return on dollar denominated assets, or R in the power of E in US. It is also the sum of the interest rate and the expected rate of depreciation of the peso. So we have the equation also. So after we have the expressions for our total expected return on both peso and dollar denominated assets, now we need to think about how we will allocate our portfolio between these two types of assets. Now there are three possibilities. The first one, the total rate of return for the on the peso denominated assets exceeds the expected total rate of return on dollar denominated assets. If this happens, we have to reallocate the portfolio towards the peso denominated asset and selling dollars and also buying pesos in the process. And the second one, the expected total rate of return on dollar denominated assets exceeds the peso one. So if this happens, we have to reallocate the portfolio towards the dollar denominated assets, buying dollars and selling pesos in the process. And then the third one is equilibrium, which means that both of the assets is equal. So if this happens, we have no reason or incentive to reallocate our portfolio. And then if the equilibrium happens, also, this is also called as interest rate parity condition. And we also have the equation, which is derived from the previous equation from the first slide, I think it was. Yeah, this one, the return of peso denominated assets. Okay, interest rate parity condition states that the equilibrium in the foreign exchange market requires that the interest rate on peso deposits equals the interest rate on dollar deposits plus the expected rate of peso the depreciation. And we have one box here. This is the equation from the previous slide. Now, as you can see, and this is actually works not only for Mexico or United States. We can also change the equation to home and foreign country within this equation. Alright, after learning about the interest rate parity condition, we're going to be incorporating that into the new version of figure 15.3, or the previous equation on the first or the second slide. And it is about the peso market. So first, let's suppose that the interest rate parity condition actually happens, so the equilibrium exists. And then let's suppose that the value of peso increase and the exchange rate decrease. Okay, so for a given expected future exchange rate, which is the E in the power of E, which is the future exchange rate, the total expected rate of return on the dollar denominated asset, which is the R in the power of E with the US, it increased because as the exchange rate falls, the dollar denominated asset increases in value, and therefore we have the dollar denominated asset is larger than the peso. And if this happens, we actually, as the Mexican investor with the other investors, we would sell the peso denominated assets, and then we buy the dollar one. And because of this also, the SF, or the asset based demand for pesos consequently declines. As you can see on the right hand side, we have the curve, and the demand for pesos declines. Okay, to understand the adjustment process in this expanded view of peso market, let's again consider the three alternative values of the peso. The first one, the supply of pesos exceeds the demand, and therefore decreasing the value. Um, if this happens, then the trade deficit falls as Z decreases and E decreases. This decreases the supply of pesos, and foreign saving rises as the expected rate of depreciation of the peso, and therefore the expected total rate of return on dollar denominated assets falls. And then, because of that, investors move into the peso denominated assets, and this increases the demand for pesos because the investors move to the peso denominated assets. And then the second one, the demand for peso exceeds the supply of pesos, therefore increasing the value. And if this happens, the trade deficit rises as Z increases and E increases. This increases the supply of pesos. And foreign savings falls as the expected rate of depreciation of peso, and therefore the expected total rate of return on dollar denominated assets rises. And because of this, investors move out from the peso denominated assets into the dollar denominated assets, and this decreases the demand for pesos. Okay, moving on to the final one, which is the equilibrium. Okay, so I think that's all for my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Hello everyone, I'm Valerie and I will continue the presentation. I'm going to explain about interest rate expectation and exchange rates. And here is the interest rate and the peso market. So basically this curve is an extension from what Daniel already explained before in figure 15.5. From this curve at the first equilibrium with the value of peso equal to 1 per E0. From this equilibrium, suppose that the RM increase, there is an increase in demand for peso, which shifts the demand curve to the right and raises the value of the peso to 1 per E1. As you can see, the arrow shift to the right, which is experience an increase and makes a new equilibrium, which is the E1. So this is called interest rate caused by capital inflow that expands the trade deficit via the exchange rate, and an increase in the Mexican interest rate causes an appreciation of the Mexican currency in a flexible exchange rate. And what happened if the RUS increase? So the increases of RUS will also increase the total expected rate of return on dollar denominated asset. There is a decrease in demand for peso, which shifts their demand curve to the left and lowers the value of peso to 1 per E2. As you can see, the arrow shift to the left and make new equilibrium, which is E2. And this is an interest rate caused by capital outflow that contracts the trade deficit via the exchange rate, and an increase in the US interest rate causes a depreciation of the Mexican currency in a flexible exchange rate. So from this curve, we can conclude that the issue in the asset-based model of exchange rate is a change in expectation. The interest rate parity condition involves expectations from the future exchange rate. Usually it formed by the mind of investors. So the cases is similar to what I already explained, and if the investors see an increase in the RUS, then it will increase the total expected rate of return on dollar denominated asset. On the other hand, as the consequences, the value of peso will decrease and shift to the left. So this called expectation cost capital outflow, which contract the trade deficit via the exchange rate, and an increase in the expected future exchange rate for Mexico or the home country currency causes a depreciation of Mexico currency in a flexible exchange rate. Now I'm going to explain about covered versus uncovered interest rate parity. The first one is UIP or uncovered interest parity. It expressed as RH or rate in home country equal to RF or rate in foreign country plus the rate of depreciation of the home country currency. And CIP or covered interest rate parity expressed as RH equals to RF plus the forward discount rate. So basically CIP is expressed in terms of forward rate that already explained in the previous chapter, but I will briefly explain the definition. So forward rates are the rates of current contracts forward transaction in currency, usually for 1, 3, or 6 months in the future. And in actual practice, forward rate traders do make use of interest rate and spot exchange rates in the transaction on forward markets. And the CIP is considered to hold nearly exactly. It holds that the difference in interest rate should be equal the forward and spot exchange rates. Without interest rate parity, it would be very easy for banks and investors to exploit differences in currency rates and make loose profits. And if UIP is to hold, the expected rates should be very close to the forward rates. And on the right hand side, there is a difference between covered and uncovered interest rate parity. For the covered interest parity, it involves using forward or future contract to cover exchange rates which can thus be hedged in the market. Meanwhile, uncovered interest rate parity involve forecasting rates and not covering exposure to foreign exchange risk. That is, there are no forward rate contracts and it uses only the expected spot rate. And that is the difference between covered and uncovered interest rate parity. Moving on the next slide, here is the changes in currency markets. And you can see that if there is an increase in home country interest rate, the SF curve will shift to the right and the value of home currency will increase, which will appreciate the currency. On the other hand, if there is an increase in foreign country interest rate, the curve will shift to the left and the value of home currency will decrease, which causes a depreciation of home country currency. And the last is if there is an increase in expected future home country exchange rate, then the SF curve will shift to the left, and value of home currency will decrease, and the home country currency will also depreciate. And finally, this is the last part from our presentation. So the conclusion is, from the chapter 14 that already explained by the other groups, the application of purchasing power parity only in the long run. And in order to understand the short-run behavior of nominal exchange rate, we have the trade-based and asset-based models that we already explained in this chapter. And the trade-based model focuses on the response of Z minus E to changes in the nominal exchange rate, whereas the assets-based model focuses on the response of both Z minus E and SF to changes in the nominal exchange rate. The assets-based model is expressed as the interest rate parity condition. Expected future exchange rates play an important role in this condition and hence in the determination of nominal exchange rate. So this makes flexible exchange rate. I think that's all from our presentation. Thank you.